In medieval Europe, being an executioner was hardly the dream job one boasted about in the village tavern. There wasn't a sign in the market square reading, "Wanted, brave man to chop heads, good pay, flexible hours." No, no, no. Being an executioner was a profession that required the precision of a surgeon, the strength of a blacksmith, the stomach of a butcher, and often, the solitude of a leper. It was a trade burdened with a social stigma so heavy that even stray dogs looked at you with disdain. But someone had to do it, right? Someone had to maintain order, enforce justice, or what passed for justice in those days, and deal with the nightmares that came with the job. This is a detailed, almost surgical look at the grim realities of being a medieval executioner, a necessary role that cast more shadows than a castle in a storm. Becoming an executioner wasn't a choice driven by passion, like a baker drawn to the scent of fresh bread. In many cases, the job was hereditary, as if fate had decreed that your lineage was doomed to wield axes instead of plows. If your father was an executioner, your odds of following in his footsteps were as high as catching a cold in a damp dungeon. Others stumbled into the role through less direct paths. A petty thief might accept the job to escape the gallows, becoming the enforcer of the same justice that nearly condemned him. Then there were the desperate, trapped in the poverty of a Europe where hunger was a constant companion, who saw the role as a way to survive. A steady wage, however blood-stained, was better than starving in an alley. In cities where poverty tightened like a noose, the executioner's trade could be a lifeline, albeit one that came at a cost measured not in coins but in isolation, scorn, and sleepless nights. The executioner's work went far beyond swinging an axe on a scaffold. He wasn't just the man who appeared at the climax of a public spectacle, with the crowd roaring and ravens lurking on rooftops. He was also the official torturer, tasked with extracting confessions using methods that would make anyone with a shred of sensitivity blanch. From stretching bodies on the rack to applying red-hot irons or pulling nails with rusty pliers, the executioner was a master of pain, though not by choice. But his duties didn't end there. He also handled less glamorous tasks. Cleaning prison cells, where the stench of rot and despair was thick enough to cut with a knife, disposing of suicides' bodies, which no one else would touch for fear of divine curses, or clearing dead animals that fouled the streets. In some cities, he was the only one authorized to handle corpses, making him a kind of human garbage collector, cleaning up the refuse society preferred to ignore. One day he might be executing a traitor before a jeering crowd, and the next, dragging a cow's carcass through a muddy alley, with rats trailing him like he was their master. Job variety? Sure. Rewarding? Not even in the wildest dreams. Executions were the main event, the moment the executioner took center stage, but they were far from straightforward. Beheading, reserved for nobles or dignified crimes, as if any crime had glamour, demanded near-surgical precision. A dull axe or a trembling hand could turn an execution into a bloody mess, with the head half attached and the crowd roaring in fury, hurling insults, rotten vegetables, or, in the worst cases, stones. Stories abound of executioners needing multiple swings to finish the job, each clumsier than the last, while the condemned groaned and the audience grew hostile, as if the executioner were the true criminal. Hanging, used for commoners, was no easier. A poorly tied knot or a shoddy rope could prolong the condemned's agony, leaving them writhing for minutes as the crowd's mood shifted from anticipation to anger. The executioner had to calculate the condemned's weight, the rope's length, and the drop to ensure a quick death, a task requiring more math than most villagers could handle. A miscalculation wasn't just a professional embarrassment. It could turn the executioner into the target of an enraged mob. Other execution methods were even more brutal, designed to inflict maximum suffering and serve as public warnings. The wheel, reserved for heinous crimes like murder or treason, was an exercise in methodical cruelty. The executioner tied the condemned to a wooden wheel and broke their bones one by one with a club or iron bar, leaving the body shattered to die slowly, often displayed in a town square or outskirts as a grim reminder of the cost of disobedience. Burning at the stake, used for heretics or supposed witches, required the executioner to manage the fire carefully to make the spectacle last long enough to satisfy the crowd, but not so long as to seem needlessly cruel. a balance more art than science. Then there was quartering, reserved for traitors, where the executioner had to dismember the condemned, sometimes while still alive, in a process that could last hours and left everyone, including the executioner, with indelible images. Each method tested skill, endurance, and stomach, and not all executioners were up to the task. The less competent faced public humiliation or, worse, punishment from authorities for failing their duty. The executioner's tools didn't make things easier. Axes dulled with use, losing their edge after cutting through flesh and bone, and had to be sharpened with a whetstone. A long, tedious process the executioner often did himself because village blacksmiths refused to taint their hands with his work. Ropes, made of hemp or linen, wore out or snapped, especially in wet weather when humidity weakened them. Swords, though rare and reserved for high-profile executions, could fail if poorly maintained, and a clumsy sword strike was even more humiliating than one with an axe. Maintaining tools was the executioner's sole responsibility, and finding a blacksmith willing to work for someone so despised required more negotiation than buying bread at the market. Public executions were both spectacle and punishment, and the executioner was under constant pressure to perform flawlessly before an audience that could turn as wild as a stormy sea. A clean execution might earn a murmur of approval, a rare acknowledgement that felt almost like a victory. But a mistake, a poorly aimed blow, a condemned who didn't die quickly, could unleash the crowd's wrath, expressed through shouts, thrown objects, or, in extreme cases, direct violence against the executioner. There were tales of executioners attacked or even lynched for a botched execution, a reminder that their life hung by a thread as fragile as the ropes they used. Job security? Non-existent. Support from authorities? Only if it suited the whims of the local lord, who might abandon them if things went south. The social stigma was, without doubt, one of the heaviest burdens of the job. The executioner lived on the margins of society, both literally and figuratively. In many cities, he was forced to reside outside the walls, in a lonely hut where the wind carried more laments than news. In others, he lived in slums, surrounded by other unclean workers like tanners or latrine cleaners. But even there, he was a feared figure. His family, if he had one, bore the weight of his profession too. An executioner's children rarely married into normal families, doomed to wed other outcasts, like gravediggers or butchers' offspring, in marriages more about survival than love. In taverns, no one wanted to share a table with the executioner, and merchants sometimes refused to sell him goods, as if his money were cursed, tainted by the smell of death. In some regions, he was forced to wear distinctive clothing, a blood-red cloak, a hat marked with a recognizable symbol, so no one could mistake him for a respectable citizen. It was like wearing a sign that screamed, "Avoid me, I'm the one who cuts heads." Even children shied away from his path, whispering horror stories about the hooded man who lived at the village's edge, as if he were an ogre from a fairy tale. Despite this isolation, the executioner wasn't always alone. In some places, he was part of a community of outcasts that included other impure workers, like butchers, tanners, or those who cleaned the town's sewers. These groups sometimes supported each other, forming a network of solidarity among the rejected, a refuge where they could share a mug of ale without judgment. But even among them, the executioner was a figure apart, his presence a constant reminder of death. Who wants to toast with someone who spent the morning breaking bones or tightening a noose? Solitude was a constant companion, more loyal than any friend, and many executioners turned to alcohol to ease the weight of their existence. It wasn't uncommon for an executioner to end his days as a drunkard, seeking solace at the bottom of a mug that society denied him, his life reduced to a cycle of blood, scorn, and oblivion. The psychological toll was devastating, a yoke that crushed even the strongest. Today, we'd call it post-traumatic stress, but in the Middle Ages, there were no therapists or support groups to ease the burden. The executioner had to face images of blood, screams, and death day after day, with only his own resilience to carry on. Each execution was a macabre dance, the crunch of breaking bones, the hiss of a tightening rope, the crackle of a pyre. Some grew numb, treating their work like a butcher treats a slab of meat, reducing the condemned to mere objects to preserve their sanity. Others couldn't escape the nightmares that haunted them, seeing the faces of the executed in every shadow, hearing their final screams in the silence of the night. There were stories of executioners who, after years in the trade, refused to continue, preferring prison or even death over wielding the axe again. Some, the most feared, seemed to revel in the power their role gave them, their eyes glinting with a chill that froze the blood of those who met their gaze. But even these lived under the shadow of eternal damnation. The Church, ever so helpful, reminded them that their work, though necessary to maintain divine order, was also a sin, a crime against the life God created. Each execution was a step closer to a possible hell, and many executioners lived tormented by the thought that their soul was as stained as their hands. The salary, though steady, wasn't exactly something to brag about at the market. Depending on the region, an executioner might receive a fixed wage, supplemented by bonuses for each execution or torture session. In some villages, he could keep the condemned's belongings, a tattered cloak, a worthless ring, perhaps a pair of worn boots, as a grim perk that barely compensated for the effort. But don't imagine the executioner living in a grand riverside palace with servants pouring wine into silver goblets. Most barely scraped by, their earnings just covering the cost of living in a society that shunned them. They had to pay for their own tools, from sharpening axes to replacing worn ropes, and finding a landlord willing to rent to someone so despised was a challenge, as many feared their presence would curse their home. Some towns provided food or lodging, but it was often poor quality. Rancid meat that smelled worse than the dungeons, moldy bread that crunched like dry wood, and a flea-ridden cot that felt more like punishment than shelter. Luxury. Only in the fairy tales children heard on winter nights, far from the executioner's reach. Training was another hurdle, or rather, the lack of it. There were no executioner academies with stern instructors and illustrated manuals, nor a guild to teach the trade's secrets. Most learned on the job, shadowing an experienced executioner like an apprentice follows a master or, in the worst cases, improvising as they went. This led to mistakes that could be catastrophic. A poorly aimed blow not only prolonged the condemned's suffering but could turn the crowd against the executioner, making him the target of their fury. Some practiced on animals, a pig slaughtered in a pen, or on crude straw and wood dummies, but nothing prepared them for the pressure of a public execution, with hundreds of eyes judging them, the air thick with anticipation, and the drumbeat setting the spectacle's rhythm. A good executioner needed basic anatomy knowledge, where to strike to sever a spine or break a bone cleanly. But in an era when medicine was more guesswork than science, this knowledge was limited, passed down through whispers among executioners or learned through errors that could cost lives, not just the condemned's but the executioner's own if the crowd turned on him. The cultural context added another layer of complexity to their existence. In the medieval mindset, executions weren't just punishments. They were moral theater, a blend of circus and sermon that drew crowds from all social classes. Peasants, merchants, nobles, and even children gathered in the square to see justice in action, the condemned paying for their sins with blood. The executioner was the grim director of this spectacle, the man who made the punishment real, but unlike a minstrel earning coins for his songs, he reaped only silence or scorn. His role was vital but made him a scapegoat. If the execution went wrong, an axe that slipped, a rope that snapped, he was the villain. If the condemned was beloved, perhaps a thief who stole to feed his family, he was the monster. And if the crime was heinous, like murder or heresy, the crowd sometimes demanded extra cruelty, like prolonging the suffering to sate their thirst for justice. The executioner had to walk a tightrope, brutal enough to satisfy the audience, but not so much as to seem inhuman, a line so fine it often blurred under the pressure of shouts and stares. Female executioners were a rarity, almost mythical in a world where gender roles were more rigid than armor. Sometimes, an executioner's wife or daughter assisted with minor tasks, tying ropes, cleaning blood and debris from the scaffold, but a woman wielding an axe or tightening a noose was almost unthinkable. When a woman took the role, usually because no man in the family could fill it, she faced the same scorn as her male counterparts, plus the added stigma of being an anomaly in a world that valued female obedience above all. Village gossip must have been epic. Did you see the executioner's daughter? She chopped a head like it was a cabbage. But her life was no less lonely or despised, the weight of her work just as crushing. Female executioners, though rare, bore the same cross: isolation, fear of damnation, and the certainty that their name would never be spoken with respect. The executioner also navigated the treacherous waters of medieval politics. In a world where feudal lords, kings, and the church vied for power, he could find himself caught in their intrigues like a fly in a web. Executing a noble could earn him enemies among powerful families, who wouldn't hesitate to seek revenge, whether through a dagger in the night or accusations that landed him on his own scaffold. Refusing an order, on the other hand, could cost him his head, as lords tolerated no disobedience, especially from someone so low in the social hierarchy. Sometimes, he was ordered to perform an especially brutal execution to send a political message, like intimidating a rival lord's followers or quelling a budding rebellion. In these cases, the executioner had no say, merely a tool of the powerful, his hands doing the dirty work while his soul bore the consequences. Amid the horror, there were glimmers of humanity that shone like candles in the dark. Some condemned, in their final moments, thanked the executioner for a quick and clean job, a rare acknowledgement that could briefly ease the burden of his solitude. Others asked him to pray for their souls, seeing him as their last link to the living world, a bridge between life and whatever came next. These moments were scarce but could offer a sliver of solace, a reminder that, even as a bringer of death, the executioner was still human. Yet even then, he had to maintain emotional distance. Hesitating at the critical moment, letting compassion cloud his judgment, could be disastrous for both the condemned, who would suffer more, and himself, who might face the crowd's or authorities' wrath. It was a cruel balance. Being human without letting humanity consume you, a dance few could master without breaking. The relationship with religion was another minefield, a terrain fraught with contradictions. The church, which loomed over medieval life like a colossus, viewed the executioner as an ambivalent figure, caught between necessity and sin. His work was essential to punish sin and uphold divine order, but killing, even in the name of justice, was a crime against God's creation. Some executioners sought redemption by attending Mass, bowing before the altar in hopes of cleansing their soul or donating their meager savings. But they weren't always welcome. Some priests denied them communion, deeming them impure, and in certain regions, they were barred from the main church, relegated to smaller chapels or praying alone. It was a brutal hypocrisy. Society needed their work to maintain order, but treated them as spiritual pariahs, men whose existence was both necessary and damned. This rejection must have been especially painful, knowing their labor allowed the community to sleep soundly, secure in the belief that divine justice had been served. Over time, some executioners gained a certain notoriety, especially in large cities like Paris, London, or Toledo. The most skilled, those who could behead with a single stroke or tie a noose with deadly precision, could become almost mythical figures, albeit feared ones. Their names were whispered in taverns, wrapped in tales blending admiration and horror. Heard about the York executioner? They say he chopped 3 heads in one day without flinching. But this fame was a double-edged sword. Being known as the infallible executioner meant any future mistake would be a scandal, a failure recounted in squares and markets for years. In an era where rumors traveled faster than a galloping horse, a single clumsy strike could destroy a reputation built on decades of blood. The end of an executioner's career was often as grim as his life. Some died on the job, victims of an accident. A slippery axe didn't discriminate between condemned and executioner, or of a crowd's fury, turning him into the victim in a cruel twist of fate. Others retired, if they were lucky enough to save enough, but the stigma followed them to the grave. It wasn't uncommon for a retired executioner to live his final days in poverty, relying on the charity of those who once shunned him, his body hunched from years of physical labor and his mind scarred by memories. Then there was the fear of the afterlife, a weight even the hardest bore. Many executioners believed their work had damned them to hell, and some tried to atone through pilgrimages to distant shrines or donations to churches that barely tolerated them. But the shadow of their profession never left, like a stain no prayer could wash away. The executioner's daily routine was as bleak as his reputation. His mornings began early, at dawn, when the world was still cloaked in mist. He rose from a hard cot in a hut smelling of damp and solitude, spending the first hours maintaining his tools, sharpening the axe on a whetstone until its edge gleamed in the dim light, checking ropes to ensure they wouldn't snap at the critical moment, and scrubbing dried blood from the previous day's work, a constant reminder of his trade. Breakfast, if there was food, was meager: a crust of stale bread, perhaps some rancid cheese or watery broth that barely warmed the body. Then, if an execution was scheduled, he headed to the scaffold or prison, where guards eyed him with a mix of disdain and fear, as if his mere presence could taint them. If no executions were planned, he might spend the day on less visible but equally thankless tasks: cleaning dungeons, where the air was thick with mold and despair, collecting suicides' bodies, often left exposed for days, or disposing of dead animals, from stray dogs to diseased cows, tasks that reinforced his status as society's cleaner. His nights, if not spent in a tavern drowning his sorrows in sour ale, passed in solitude, with the echoes of the day's screams resonating in his mind like a drum that never stopped. The executioner's interactions with different social classes reflected his isolation. Nobles treated him as a tool, an instrument of their will, giving orders with an air of superiority that made his place in the hierarchy clear. "Make sure the head falls clean, executioner," a lord might say, as if commissioning a cut of meat at the market. Merchants and craftsmen avoided him, fearing his presence brought bad luck or tainted their trade. At the market, stall-holders averted their eyes as he passed, some crossing themselves as if seeing the devil himself. Peasants, who made up most of the execution crowd, viewed him with a mix of fear and fascination, shouting insults when an execution went awry or murmuring praise if the job was flawless. Children, with the innocent cruelty only the young possess, made up rhymes about the hooded man, and ran from him, as if he were a monster from their nightmares. On rare occasions, a condemned person might show a glimmer of gratitude or humanity, a "thank you for making it quick," or a plea to deliver a final message. But these moments were as fleeting as a candle in a gale, snuffed out by the reality of his work. Regional variations added nuances to his role, as if each corner of Europe had its own way of making executioners suffer. In Germanic lands, the executioner might enjoy some official status, with perks like keeping the condemned's clothes or a modest but steady salary, more reliable than many peasants. In some German cities, he was even allowed to attend certain public ceremonies, though always in the back row, a reminder of his place. In France or England, however, he was little more than a pariah, his name spoken in whispers, his presence clearing streets. In rural areas, his work might be less frequent but more brutal, with small but savage crowds eager for a spectacle to break the monotony of their lives. In large cities like Paris or London, executions were massive events, with thousands demanding blood, drama, and a satisfying end. In southern Europe, like Spain during the Inquisition, pyres added a religious fervor to his task, each burning a ritual where the executioner was both in four rows and actor in a divine drama. In Scandinavia, where the climate was as harsh as the punishments, executions could take place in extreme conditions, with the executioner battling ice and wind to keep the scaffold standing. Each region had its quirks, but the scorn for the executioner was universal, a language needing no translation. The executioner's legal responsibilities were another burden, adding absurdity to an already surreal trade. Beyond executing, he often had to keep records of crimes, sentences, and execution dates, tedious paperwork requiring precision that contrasted with his work's brutality. In an era when many couldn't read or write, the executioner might be one of the few in the village with this skill, learned out of necessity or passed down by a mentor. A mistake in the records, a wrong date, a misspelled name, could land him in trouble with authorities, who weren't known for patience or leniency. He also had to ensure the scaffold was ready, the rope secure, and the firewood sufficient for pyres, a logistical effort that consumed time and energy. Sometimes, he negotiated with guards or local lords over execution details, a quick death to avoid riots or a prolonged spectacle to appease a bloodthirsty crowd. These decisions weren't always his, but he bore the consequences, whether the crowd's anger or a lord's disdain for a job deemed inadequate. Superstition permeated his life like a thick fog, cloaking him in an aura of mystery and fear. In an age where a thunderstorm was seen as God's wrath and a failed harvest as witches' work, the executioner was a figure touched by darkness. Some believed he had mystical powers, able to curse enemies with a glance or commune with the dead on moonless nights. Others thought he was cursed, his soul tainted by every life he took, doomed to wander eternally without rest. These beliefs isolated him further, making him a pariah even among other outcasts. Yet in some villages, superstitions worked in his favor. The clothes of the executed or fragments of the hangman's rope were said to have healing powers, curing ailments or warding off evil spirits. This made the executioner an unwilling healer, sought in secret by those desperate for a remedy, though they approached with hearts pounding in fear. These visits were rare but added irony to his existence. The bringer of death, an unlikely savior. The physical toll was another torment, a punishment his body paid daily. Wielding an axe or breaking bones with a club required considerable strength but left lasting marks. Chronic arm pain, a hunched back from the weight of tools and stress, joints creaking like old wood. Accidents were common. A slippery axe could cut the executioner himself, leaving scars that told stories no one wanted to hear, and doctors weren't eager to treat him, fearing association with someone so despised. Working on a frozen scaffold in winter, with numb hands and biting wind, was a test of endurance few could bear without complaint. Ropes stiffened in the cold, making knots tricky. Axes slipped in frozen hands, and pyres, vital for burnings, could be snuffed out by a gust, forcing the executioner to improvise before an impatient crowd that tolerated no errors. The executioner's clothing was a symbol of his isolation, a visible mark of his status. In some regions, he wore a hood or mask, not for anonymity but to signal his difference, a reminder he wasn't one of the crowd. Elsewhere, his attire was practical, designed to shield him from blood, debris, and the elements. Thick cloaks for the cold, leather gloves for durability, boots to wade through the scaffold's mud and filth. But even this clothing screamed death from afar, and no one mistook him for a knight or merchant. Keeping it clean was a thankless task, as village washers often refused to touch it, fearing its curse would transfer to them. Many executioners ended up washing their own clothes in a river, under the wary eyes of villagers, an act both necessary and a reminder of their solitude. Handling bodies post-execution was another burden few considered. Some corpses were left exposed as warnings, hung on crosses or displayed in iron cages outside the village, and the executioner had to ensure they weren't stolen by desperate families or devoured by wild animals. Others were buried in remote cemeteries reserved for the impure, like criminals, suicides, or heretics, requiring him to dig graves in hard soil or haul heavy bodies through muddy paths. If the condemned was a noble, there might be specific instructions, perhaps delivering the body to the family or a distant church, adding more pressure to an already exhausting job. In some cases, he had to dismember the body for display in different locations, a public reminder of justice's power, but also a task that left him covered in blood and his mind filled with images he couldn't erase. Interactions with authorities were a constant headache, a power struggle where the executioner was always at a disadvantage. He depended on local lords, judges, or the clergy for orders, but these weren't always clear or consistent. Sometimes, they changed at the last moment. A condemned slated for beheading might be switched to hanging to save time, or the executioner was asked to prolong suffering to send a message to rebels. Disobeying, even out of conscience, could mean his own execution, as authorities tolerated no insubordination, especially from someone so low in the social order. Yet obeying had risks too. Executing a noble could earn the enmity of a powerful family, while a poorly performed execution could anger the crowd or displease the lords, leaving the executioner caught between a rock and a hard place. The executioner's impact on the community was profound, an echo that resonated far beyond the scaffold. Public executions didn't just punish the condemned, they sent a message to all present: defy the order, and this is your fate. As the enforcer of that message, the executioner was a central figure in this social theater, but never the hero. His presence reminded everyone that justice could be as brutal as the crime. evoking a mix of fear, respect, and resentment. In some cases, he was seen as a necessary evil, a man who did the dirty work so others didn't have to. In others, he was a monster in human guise, embodying society's worst fears. Executions reinforced the power of lords and the church, showing the masses what awaited if they dared rebel. But they also fueled a cycle of violence, where justice's brutality became a spectacle that desensitized crowds. The executioner's personal life was a wreck, a broken puzzle that never fit together. Forming a family was tough when no one wanted to marry the hooded man. His children, if he had any, grew up in a world that shunned them as much as him, doomed to be the executioner's kids, a title that closed doors and opened wounds. Wives, if he found one, endured the same isolation and village whispers, living in a shadow that never lifted. In some regions, executioners could only marry women from equally stigmatized families, like tanners, gravediggers, or latrine cleaners, forming unions more about survival than love. These families lived on the margins, in a parallel world where normalcy was a luxury they couldn't afford. Winter added another layer of misery to an already thankless job. Executing on a frozen scaffold, with numb hands and wind cutting like a knife, tested even the hardiest. Ropes stiffened in the cold, complicating knots and raising the risk of a botched execution. Axes slipped in frozen hands, and pyres, crucial for burnings, could be extinguished by a gust, forcing the executioner to improvise before an impatient crowd that tolerated no mistakes. The cold also made bodies harder to handle, especially if they needed dismembering or transporting to a distant cemetery. In winter months, the executioner worked under added pressure, with smaller crowds but the same demand for perfection. Preparing for an execution was meticulous, a ritual starting long before the condemned reached the scaffold. The executioner had to inspect the scaffold, ensuring the planks were sturdy and wouldn't buckle under the condemned's weight or the crowd's pressure. Ropes were checked thoroughly, tested to avoid embarrassing breaks. 4 pyres would have to be stacked in a pattern ensuring a steady but not too rapid burn, an art requiring experience and patience. Sometimes, he negotiated with the condemned about their final wishes, a sip of wine, a specific prayer, a message for their family, though fulfilling them was optional. Refusing could anger the crowd or the condemned, complicating things further, but giving in too much could make him seem weak, a luxury he couldn't afford. The audience, a mix of curious peasants, bored nobles, and frightened children, was unpredictable. Some came to mock the condemned, others to pray for their soul, and some simply because an execution was the most exciting thing in the village for weeks. But the crowd could turn hostile in an instant, and the executioner was often the target of their fury if something went wrong, from a slipping knot to a blow that didn't kill instantly. Superstition cloaked his life like pyre smoke, wrapping him in mystery and fear. In an age where everything from storms to illness was blamed on supernatural forces, the executioner was seen as touched by darkness. Some believed he had mystical powers, able to curse foes with a word or summon spirits at night. Others thought he was damned, his soul stained by every life he took, a man walking among the living but belonging to the dead. In some villages, superstitions made him an ambivalent figure, feared but sought by those who believed executed clothes or hangman's rope fragments could heal ailments or ward off evil. These beliefs isolated him further but gave him strange power, born of fear rather than respect. The physical toll was relentless, a daily reminder that his body paid as high a price as his soul. Wielding an axe or breaking bones with a club required strength but left chronic pains that settled in his arms, back, and joints like unwelcome guests. Accidents were common. A slippery axe could cut the executioner, leaving scars that told tales of blood and error. Doctors, if any were willing to treat him, hesitated, fearing his curse would taint them. In winter, the cold turned every task into an endurance test, with numb hands struggling to control axe or rope. Pyres could be snuffed out by wind, forcing him to stoke them under the crowd's impatient gaze. Each workday was a battle against body and elements, a war that left him more exhausted and broken with every execution. The executioner's clothing was a symbol of his isolation, a mark distinguishing him as an outsider in his own world. In some regions, he wore a hood or mask, not to hide his face but to signal his status, a visible reminder of his difference. Elsewhere, his attire was practical, shielding him from blood, debris, and elements. Thick cloaks for cold, leather gloves for durability, boots for wading through scaffold mud and filth. But even this clothing screamed death from afar, and no one mistook him for a knight or merchant. Keeping it clean was a task village washers avoided, fearing its curse. Many executioners washed their own clothes in a river, under villagers' wary eyes, an act both necessary and a reminder of their solitude. The long-term impact of his work on society was complex, a tapestry woven with fear, power, and contradiction. Public executions reinforced the authority of lords and the church, showing the masses what awaited defiance. But they also fueled a cycle of violence, where justice's brutality became a spectacle that desensitized crowds, turning death into grim entertainment. The executioner, as the visible face of the system, was both an agent of order and a symbol of its cruelty, trapped in a paradox, essential to society yet condemned to live outside it. His work shaped the collective psyche, reminding all of life's fragility and justice's weight, but it also left a mark on him, a man living and dying under his own axe's shadow. The logistics of executions were a challenge in themselves, a puzzle requiring skill and patience. Transporting a condemned person from prison to scaffold could be an ordeal, especially if they resisted, screaming or fighting as guards dragged them through streets filled with onlookers. In some cities, the executioner had to build the scaffold himself, cutting wood and hammering planks under villagers' suspicious gazes. He also coordinated with guards, who often treated him with disdain, and dealt with local lords' demands, who might change the execution method at the last moment. An execution could be cancelled by a royal pardon, leaving him with a prepared scaffold and a disappointed crowd, or called suddenly after an unexpected crime, forcing him to rush to the scaffold with an unsharpened axe. Relations with the condemned were emotionally perilous. Some treated him with contempt, seeing him as the face of their fate, a man no more worthy of respect than the rope that would kill them. Others sought his compassion, begging for a quicker, less painful death or to deliver a final message to their family. These interactions could be heart-wrenching, especially when the condemned was young, repentant, or simply caught in the web of an unforgiving justice system. But the executioner couldn't afford to empathize too much. His job depended on maintaining composure, even in the face of the most desperate pleas. Each condemned was a reminder of his own humanity, but also of the need to bury it under a mask of indifference. The executioner's role in the local economy was peculiar. Though his salary was modest, he sometimes received tips from wealthy condemned hoping for a quicker, less painful death, a macabre barter adding irony to his work. In some cities, he could sell the executed's clothes or belongings, generating a small extra income, though buyers were usually other outcasts or superstitious folk who believed in the mystical properties of such items. This trade, though profitable, was seen as grim, and villagers buying such relics did so in secret, fearing discovery. Unpredictability was another constant. An execution could be cancelled at the last minute by a lord's whim, leaving the executioner with a useless scaffold and a frustrated crowd. Conversely, a riot or sudden crime could force him to work without warning, rushing to the scaffold with a racing heart and unsteady hands. This lack of control over his life added frustration to an already thankless job, making each day a gamble against fate. His relationship with animals was another curious aspect. Beyond disposing of animal carcasses, he sometimes had to slaughter sick or dangerous beasts, from rabid dogs to cows that had diseased a village. In rare cases, he was ordered to execute animals accused of crimes, like pigs that attacked children or hens that, per superstition, laid cursed eggs. These executions, though absurd, were taken seriously by authorities, and the executioner had to perform them with the same precision as with humans, adding a surreal note to his already strange existence. The executioner's impact on popular culture was notable, though not always positive. Though feared, he sometimes became a legendary figure, appearing in troubadours' tales and tavern songs. These stories exaggerated his feats, painting him as a man of supernatural strength or a cursed being wandering the night. But these legends, far from humanizing him, distanced him further from society, turning him into a myth that inspired more fear than empathy. As centuries passed, the executioner's role slowly evolved. In the 13th century, the Inquisition brought new punishments, like mass pyres, requiring complex logistics and an even stronger stomach. By the 15th century, new weapons like crossbows introduced modern execution methods in some regions, though the axe and noose remained favorites. These changes forced the executioner to adapt, learning new techniques without formal training, a challenge that added more pressure to an already exhausting job. Ultimately, being an executioner in the Middle Ages was a life defined by paradox. You were essential but hated, necessary but feared, skilled but despised. Every axe swing, every knot tied, every bone broken was a reminder that your work upheld order, but at a personal cost few could imagine. The next time you see an image of a hooded executioner, think of the life behind the mask, a life of blood, solitude, and a burden few could bear. If that's not a lesson in humanity's contradictions, nothing is.